Welcome everyone to Protect's Conflict Resolution Management webinar. My name is Bill Carew, and our presenter today and conflict resolution specialist is Brent Borgenvog. Before I get into a brief bio for Brent, I'd like to set a few of the ground rules for the webinar. We're going to be pausing for questions at 12:15, so please feel free to enter questions, any questions that you may have for Brent via the questions window. We'll be moderating those and going through a few of those at 12:15. At approximately 12:30, Brent will be wrapping up the content of the webinar, and we'll have a second question and answer session available for you at that point in time. And again, if you have questions, please put them in through the questions window. Okay, our expert today, conflict resolution, is Brent Borgenvog. He's an experienced facilitator, program designer, and professional coach and human resource development specialist. Brent has over 15 years of experience working with leaders in a variety of industries. In his professional practice, Brent works with both groups and individuals to help them maximize their personal and professional development in the areas of interpersonal effectiveness, developing additional leadership capacity, sales effectiveness, corporate strategic planning, as well as personal goal development and achievement. For the past decade, Brent has focused on designing and facilitating customized learning and development programs and courses anchored in emotional intelligence and behavioral-based competency models. He's a recognized leader in developing IT professionals and is certified and skilled in several assessment processes, including DISC and Facet 5. Brent, I'd like to thank you for joining us today and presenting for us, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Bill. Great to be here today and talking to everybody about this topic, which is, it's a big one. And so when you start to look at the workplace today, what I'm seeing, I guess, in my practice, and I guess many of the people attending today are seeing it as well, is the conflict is always a challenge in the workplace. And so let's dive in. It's a big topic, and let's see what we're going to talk about. So when we start to look at conflict, I like to start with, like, what are the sources? So when we talk about workplace conflict, it's a little bit different than, say, conflict, global conflict, or maybe even, interpersonal conflict, because there is a context. Our workplace, we're expected to behave in a professional way. We have specific roles. We have a job description. We have a specific accountability or several accountabilities. So we look at the workplace, we're really dealing with a sort of very specific scenario, and we start to look at what are the causes of workplace conflict. One of the biggest one is misunderstanding, poor communication. So when we have two people working together, there's a great opportunity for poor communication to set people off and trigger some sort of challenge or some sort of conflict. So that's a big one that people face today, and it's probably one that has been made or amplified by the fact that a lot of us, we don't necessarily have face-to-face communication so much anymore. We do a lot of it through email or messenger or those types of communication devices where we don't actually see the person. So what we see is that poor communication due to that is getting to be a bigger source of conflict in the workplace. We also see that a personality difference can be the source of workplace conflict, and that's something that, it's one person has one motive, one person has one way of working. Maybe this kind of person who's very direct and blunt, and maybe you're less so. So just that difference in personality can be a big source of conflict in the workplace. And so things like emotional intelligence come into play. We need to understand the differences there. Another one which people don't, I think, appreciate as much as really what it does cause is role conflict. And this is where, you start working in a group of people, you have a job description, but you've also got a secondary role in your workplace where you are bringing something else to the workplace. It might be you're the person who recognizes people's birthdays, or you're the person who gets the group together on Thursday to go out. So those informal roles sometimes can cause conflict when maybe somebody new joins the team, or some change happens in the workplace and your role in the work group changes a little bit, and that can cause a good degree of conflict in the workplace. And it's all of a sudden, wait a second, what are you doing here? We can also see that work style, so the way people do things. A good example might be a perfectionist working with somebody who's less detail focused. That can be a big source of conflict for people when people aren't doing things the same way that I would, let's say. Change is another one. So when you start to look at change and what's going on in the workplace today, you see a lot of people coping with a lot of change, a lot of different things that are happening, big source of conflict. And then lastly, I know my slide says 5, but it all sums up in the sense of, you see stress and challenging work conditions these days. People are under a lot of stress to deliver their projects and their products on time, quickly, perfect. So we're all being asked to do a little bit more. And if you start to get under stress for a long period of time, it's very easy to get provoked, and it's very easy for stress to contribute to workplace conflict. So there are a bunch of others, but these are the biggies that people are facing, and probably some of you are maybe going, "Yep, that's me," and you're not alone in that. So when we start to look at conflict, what's happening? What's going on in the workplace? What is actually, we need to break it down. So in the course, when we talk about managing stress, we look at sort of what are the ways we break things down? What are the different models? What are the ways that we can understand how to bring this conflict to a resolution? And when you start looking at the workplace concept, the main idea is we want to think about the relationship. If I don't care about the relationship with you, and maybe I'm in a situation where I can walk away and I just don't care about that relationship, then I don't really have to be worried so much about conflict resolution because I can just walk away. And people do that. But at the workplace, we have to continue to work together, and we have to work together effectively, maybe for a long time. So when we start to use the idea of like, so how do I deal with a personality difference or poor communication or maybe different work style, I want to start thinking about the relationship that I'm needing to preserve and be part of. And then I need to start about like, well, how did we get here? So sometimes people wonder like, so what happened? How did we get here? I don't know how we got to this conflict. And so if we think about the stages of conflict, like what causes it, we start to see, little things start to happen. We pay no attention maybe. Somebody does something or somebody says something and kind of, oh yeah, whatever, or I just kind of ignore it or whatever. And so we don't deal with it right away. And then it starts to get bigger. So something else happens. Somebody else says something. Somebody else does something. And then that conflict starts to escalate. And here's where we start to see it's a little bit more visible. And when it's in the emergence phase, what we see is, it's just like below the surface. It's just simmering there and it's just waiting to find a way out. And so when it escalates, what happens is we start to see the conflict that we're all talking about. We see emotion, we see maybe bad language, bad behavior. We see a variety of different things that happen. Then we get into the stalemate stage, which is like we're fighting. This is out and out, whatever. And at this point, we're thinking, okay, well, you know what? I'm going to quit this job, or I hate this person, or whatever. And we get into that stalemate stage where we think, okay, now what do I do? And it's called stalemate because it's like we're left without a solution. We don't know what to do. We don't know what action to take, and we can feel stuck. At this point, what you'll find is some people, what they'll do is they'll just ignore the conflict and hope it goes away. But it never does go away. It just kind of, in some cases, it kind of goes underground. I've worked with clients where conflict has simmered for months between maybe two work groups, and then it comes up every once in a while, and it comes up in a meeting, or sometimes even a very inopportune situation in front of a client or in front of a boss, right? So it never goes away. So if we don't deal with it at this stage, we're going to have some problems later on. And from a leader's perspective, I do a lot of work with leaders as well. And so as a leader, you're also looking at this going, all right, so how's my team doing? It's a bit like, oh, the kids are in the back bedroom, they're a little too quiet, right? So, and then all of a sudden things happen. So as a leader, this is also really important because we want to look at where are the people that we're working with, at what stage of the conflict are they, and how are we going to move forward? And we move forward into the de-escalation stage. That's where we start to apply some of the models, some of the tools that we have available to us. Things like we want to take down the emotion. We want to focus on the facts. We want to focus on the needs of the situation. One of the things that you'll see is that when we talk about conflict, we have to distinguish between needs and wants. I want something, but I need something else. And so when we're looking at the de-escalation strategies, we want to focus on what are the needs, and we're focusing specifically on a win-win interests-based outcome, because that's the one that allows us to preserve the relationship and continue to work together. Afterwards, we find some sort of settlement or some sort of resolution. We're able to come to some sort of agreement, and we move on. The one that I find people forget to do sometimes is this last one, and that's the peace building and reconciliation part. That's where we have to, we have to work a little bit harder at the relationship. We have to make way and find a way to kind of find our positive things that bring us together. It's not just at the settlement resolution, okay, fine, I'll work with you, whatever, and walk away. It's more, okay, let's talk about things. Let's get to know each other a little better. Let's make sure that we don't allow conflict to take over again in the future. So that stage is a really important one, and it sets it up so that when we deal with conflict again, because it's not like we can work in a work environment where conflict doesn't happen. In fact, we want to make sure that our workplace does have some degree of conflict, because we know that conflict is also connected to creativity and innovation. And we look at effective teams, and we know that it's not that effective teams exist in a land or a world without conflict. It's that they exist in a world where people who are in that conflict have the tools, skills, and ability to resolve that conflict, put the differences aside, find a way to work together, and then move forward. So we're not in any way or shape looking to get in a place where there is no conflict. What we're going to do is try and figure out, okay, so when I'm detecting at that emergent stage, I'm detecting some conflict, and before it escalates, what can I do to prevent it escalating and becoming emotional and destructive? So I mentioned a couple of approaches that we want to think about. And so the three that we want to consider, win-win. It's also called the interest-based resolution, because we're focusing on satisfying interests of the different parties in the conflict. Win-win doesn't mean happy-happy. Doesn't mean everybody walks away going, yeah, happy-happy. But it's a way of finding a way to work together, and within the context of that relationship, keep building that relationship. The other two, and probably the most common ones that we're more familiar with, is win-lose. And I think a lot of times when we approach conflict, a lot of people think, okay, win-lose. Somebody's going to win, somebody's going to lose. I'm not going to lose. Or maybe it's last time I lost, this time I win. I don't care. So win-lose it's a typical model that we see with people. It's sort of one of the things that people sort of come into a conflict. Sometimes that's what they're programmed to look at as an outcome. And it's one that can often escalate into what's called the power base, or also known as lose-lose, or also known, my lawyer got a new Mercedes-Benz and I got nothing. So with power-based, what happens is we go back to, okay, well, who has more organizational power? Who's going to make the other person comply? Who is going to, I'm more powerful than you. I have this vice president on my side. It's a bit like, mom, go fight so-and-so's mom. So win-lose, when it's handled badly or it's a really bad outcome, often escalates into that negative power-based or lose-lose scenario. The other thing to think about then is when we think about approaches, we need to think about ourselves. And so one of the things that we realize is that a lot of us tend to repeat a similar pattern. Think about yourself last time you had conflict. Think about how you approached it maybe a time before. You'll find you tend to repeat the same pattern in approaching conflict. That tends to reflect our values and beliefs. So we're acting out sort of some of the things that we understand. And for most of us, if we haven't taken some kind of training or development, it reflects how we learned from other people to resolve conflict. It might be something we saw at home. It might be something we learned at school or we did at school. So it tends to reflect sort of something that we've learned how to handle. That pattern tends to be something that repeats. So I think we're at 12:15. So Bill, do we have any questions?
Brent and I have three so far, and I'll fire those off to here. And anyone else that would like to ask a question at this point or any further in the presentation, please feel free to do so. Brent, the first question, when we have a conflict, oftentimes, in fact, every time there's emotions that are involved. What's the best way to remove emotions from the conflict resolution process?
Vodka. Uh, Absolutely no vodka. The best way, so when we talk about emotions, right, there's a couple of things that we look at. One is we anchor in our emotional intelligence. So some people are more emotional than others, and our awareness of our emotionality can help us in terms of reining in our emotions. One of the strategies is focusing on facts. So rather than focusing about how we feel, let's focus on what is the actual fact of the situation. Another strategy along with that is to have people write things down rather than speak. If you've ever written anything down, you've noticed it's probably easier to write with very little emotion. So sometimes it helps people kind of gather their thoughts and focus on the facts, take out the emotion. And the other thing is, when we start to look at emotionality and removing emotions and conflict, sometimes the best thing for us to do is to say, hey, you know what, let's just take a break here. Can we talk about this tomorrow? And when I'm saying talk about it tomorrow, I don't mean go home and plot, what I'm going to do to you tomorrow. I mean, is go home, take a realistic view of what's going on, maybe write down the facts, put a little time between us. So it's really, one is our emotional intelligence, our ability to rein in our emotions. The next is removing our emotions by focusing on facts. Maybe trying a strategy like writing things down, or maybe even using, if we know we're really, really, really emotionally involved, some people find getting a neutral third party, like a neutral third party who can help us kind of moderate our discussion can be helpful. The worst thing you can do is stopping to talk about it. That's the worst thing you can do.
Okay. I've got one other related question. What would you say the influence would be of culture on the conflict resolution process?
Oh, that's a good one. Some cultures, I think there's a big influence because culture reflects how we approach many things, and conflict is one of those things. You look at certain cultures where you are very much focused on avoiding conflict, very much focused on controlling your own emotions. You look at other cultures, and culture can be regional. It doesn't have to be sort of an ethnic culture. It can be even a regional culture, and you might see certain people where let's just fight it out. We just fight it out and then we move forward and we go on with it. And that tends to be maybe a family culture could be an example of that. But culture can definitely affect it. It could also be, for example, it could be an overlay when you're talking about, respect for older people. Certain cultures, I can't contradict what that person says, and that might even result in conflict, but we're not able to address it. Oh, we don't talk to people like that. We don't bring those things up. So conflict does play a big role there.
Another unrelated question, Brent. How do you deal with someone that you need to work with, but is not talking to you and potentially giving you the cold shoulder?
Ah, you're talking about a passive aggressive person. And so when we talk about conflict, we can see sort of I see it kind of as two big groups. You get people who become passive aggressive. They withdraw, they don't talk, they don't want to engage. One of the things is to recognize that they're doing that because they need to control the environment and they don't feel safe. So underlying a lot of conflict is a lack of feeling safe. So a person like that is they're going to stop communication, they're not going to want to interact, and they're not going to want to move forward because they're afraid they're going to lose. So when you have those types of people, I think one of the best things is to just let them know that you'd like to talk to them about resolving the conflict, that you want to make sure that it's not a personal thing, it's not us against you or me against you. It's just you'd like to make sure that they have a way to make it safe and have an open discussion. And sometimes people find that with that type of situation, it maybe starts with you saying, so here's how I feel about the situation. So when we're talking about conflict, one of the best ways to start is maybe saying, I'm sorry that this has happened. I'm sorry we're at conflict. I don't like us to be at conflict. I'd like to find a way for us to work together. Here's how I see things. From my perspective, here's how I see it. I'd really like to know what's your view of the situation. So recognizing that people involved in the conflict can have different perspectives and views, I think is a good way to start that conversation.
Okay, I have our last question before we resume the presentation, and that is, can you address for us, Brent, how different generations deal with conflict? Are there generational issues in conflict resolution?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I think one of the biggest things that we see with generational issues is that younger generations are finding it more challenging to deal with conflict. So when I deal with millennials, for example, their situation has been, from when they started going to school, working together, being collaborative, not necessarily comfortable with conflict. And what happens is the conflict tends to play out in an indirect way. So we're seeing now, especially with things like the internet and social media, we see conflict is not sort of something that is kind of addressed face to face with a person. It comes out in a third way, like posts on social media or texts or those types of things. So I find that learning how to really, do a face-to-face discussion and sit down with a person to resolve the conflict, while it's not something that any generation is comfortable with. I will say that nobody's ever comfortable with it, but I think that with some of the younger generations, there's been less opportunity to practice that and to build skill with that. So I'm seeing in my practice, a lot of my clients are asking me to teach workplace conflict resolution, especially to younger generations.
Okay, great. I'd like to thank our attendees for those questions. We're going to let Brent resume his presentation, and when he's finished, we'll break again for more questions. So any folks that have more questions, feel free to direct them to us. Brent, you can continue.
Thank you. So when we start to look about being successful, one of the things is we need to look at, well, what is actually causing the conflict? And I think at this point, we need to think about what's our own role. We tend to go into conflict resolution and we tend to say, well, it's not my fault, it's the other person's fault. But I think when we're looking at sort of resolving conflict effectively, we need to kind of take a broader view. What's really at play here? And then we have to take the appropriate actions, which is meaning we need to apply the proper model, the proper way of having that discussion. So what this is anchored in, of course, as I've said before, are things like emotional intelligence, our communication skills, because one of the things that we definitely want to do is we want to keep talking. When we don't keep talking, when we don't keep having open communication, we start to see the problem where the conflict becomes latent, it becomes under the water, and it becomes basically a bigger problem over a period of time. So we look at things like, how are we able to manage our self-awareness? Do we think about ourselves, could I have done something? Could I control myself better? Am I doing this for revenge? Am I doing this as payback? And then we want to think about what's the bigger picture, that relationship that we're talking about, that work relationship, because we need to keep working together. When we start to look at, what makes this important, right? So we start to see that conflict, when we're able to resolve it, we see better communication on teams. We see better communication, and it results in higher productivity. It results typically in a healthier and more respectful workplace. People understand, it sets new norms. It sets new ways of us working together. And that's when we've been able to have that discussion, that dialogue, which says, how do we resolve our conflict? And we're able to resolve conflict. Overall, better teamwork, better collaboration is the result. And I think this is one of the things, this point here, better creativity and innovation. When I've been doing a lot of looking at, so how do leaders, how do teams, how do they become more creative? How do they become more innovative? And it always happens when they're under a lot of pressure and there's a lot of opportunity for failure and there's a lot of opportunity for conflict. One of the things that I think of myself is that when I'm doing that mental leap of de-emotionalizing, disengaging emotionally from the conflict, I say back to myself, okay, I'm going to typically get a better result of what I'm doing by resolving this conflict. And then I tell myself the creative process is not possible without conflict. And so it comes back to my goal, which is I need to preserve the relationship, but at the same time, I want to identify what are some creative and innovative things that can come out of this. And so that's a really important thing to keep in mind. We see teams are better at managing change. They're better at handling change. They're better at dealing with the unexpected, and they're more able to focus on what's really important and what needs to be focused on. So how does it affect your career? I think is one thing to look at my immediate situation, but let's look at the longer picture here. And that's your career and the time you have ahead of you. And so one of the things is we want to be known for somebody who's able to work collaboratively with people, to work with people, whether they're sometimes difficult people, doesn't matter. We need to be able to make sure that we can work with others. We need to be able to be seen that we can build relationships. And so our ability to resolve conflict is very much anchored in our ability to resolve and build effective relationships. It's ultimately going to allow us to influence the advancement of our career because we're going to be faced with conflict, and those who are looking to promote us and advance us are looking at our ability to resolve conflict. If we're not able to resolve conflict, it's really hard for them to see us as promotable or help us advance our career. As I said before, we start to look at the role that we play in terms of creativity and innovation and fostering and developing that. And ultimately, for some of us, it's about being better supervisors, leaders, and managers. So I talked about different models, and so I want to spend the last couple of minutes talking about that. When you start to look at how do we approach resolving conflict, there are different models. There's more than these three that I'm going to show you, but these are the biggies. So the interpersonal model is we start to look at what are the interpersonal aspects of the situation. This is maybe personality, personality style, aspects of how we look at our role, how do we sort of split up different aspects of it. And sometimes it's maybe just a misunderstanding. Sometimes it's like understanding that, okay, well, this is this person and that's how they're going to behave and it's nothing about me and maybe we shouldn't focus on the conflict. So the interpersonal model is a really important one to understand, anchored in our emotional intelligence. The conflict wheel model it allows us to break the different aspects of the conflict down into different dimensions, some of which are controllable, some of which are not controllable. So our perspective on something is controllable. The fact that certain things happened is no longer controllable. So we look and focus on what happened, and then we look at how do we move forward based on what we can control and what we can discuss. So it's a very powerful one, and it helps us kind of, for some of the people that are a little bit more detail focused or more sort of structured, people often like this one because it allows us to sort of break things down into different compartments and understand how we can move forward with a focus on one or two. The last is what we call the polarity model, and that's one where we're not able to come to any kind of resolution, but we need to manage two competing needs. So the conflict is there, people have different needs for that conflict. We can't solve it, but we can look at how do we manage it. So that's a very interesting one where we can't just solve everything. There's no perfect answer for everything, but we can manage the conflict in a way that sort of sees the upside of the different options. So these are the three that are really important. If you start Googling and start looking out there, you're going to see there's a lot more, but these are the three that I find really work really well. So the last thing I guess is I want to let you know about what are some of the courses that we've got coming up based on this, but I know we're right, oh, it's 12:30. Oh my goodness, this has never happened to me. So Bill, any more questions?
We certainly have more questions, and if you needed to finish anything up, you're certainly at liberty to do that, or I can fire off the first question.
I'm ready to go.
Okay. How do you handle conflict when the conflict is with your direct report?
When the conflict is with your direct report, I'm assuming based on this that the direct report is causing the conflict. I mean, like anything, whether it's our boss or our direct report, we need to find a way to open the communication and get a perspective on what the conflict is. One of the challenges is that when we're the boss, we're in a position of power and we need to be aware of that. But we also need to make it safe for that person to bring up their perspective. So there are strategies where it's like we're stating, so here's how I see the situation. Now I need to understand what's your perspective of the situation, and we need to have that open communication. And that means sometimes sort of sitting down and saying, you know what, okay, I'm not the boss. Let's just talk about this. How are you seeing things? But that is a challenge.
Okay, how do you identify healthy conflict versus unproductive conflict?
Um, Well, so healthy conflict is, when you think about healthy conflict, you're thinking about people are putting ideas forward, they're focusing on the facts, they're not taking things personally, they're willing to maybe change their perspective, change their view, they're open to what are the possible outcomes from another person's suggestion. Unhealthy conflict is one where people take a position, they stop listening to another person, and they spend all their time basically defending that position. And the subtext of that is, I'm right with my position. So healthy conflict says, you know what, I see this idea. I have a different idea. I see you have a different idea. Let's explore that different idea. I don't necessarily agree with it, but okay, let's talk about it. Help me understand. And healthy conflict is where the people involved in the conflict are willing to take another perspective, another view, maybe change their opinion and yield to the other person's perspective.
Okay, I have two more questions in the question queue, so if anybody in the audience would like to ask any more questions, feel free to type them in. I'm going to ask the first of the last two here to Brent now. How do you
Okay.
recommend handling a team that is resistant to change and the conflict that then follows?
Yeah. So one of this, when you start to look at change, it's really also around the concept of stakeholder engagement and really spending a lot of time getting people to talk about how they feel about the change, but then focusing on the future. So like when you think about dealing with change, right? People are looking backwards. They're focused on what they're losing. They're focused on what's going away. And so when we have a team that's stuck in conflict, what they're really doing is trying to hang on, or what they're often doing is trying to hang on to the past. And so what we really want to do is give them a way to understand, okay, so these are the things that aren't going to change. And these are the new things that we're going to be able to do. And this is the support that you're going to be able to get. And change is hard, but there are some benefits to moving forward. So it's recognizing that that team is maybe focusing on what they're losing, because we know from an emotional perspective, people will focus more on what they're losing than what they're gaining. And it's really about sitting down with the team, having open dialogue, and then engaging. I think one of the things when you start to look at resolving conflict, whether it's with a team or an individual, it's finding things that people can do to start moving forward. And so sometimes maybe we're the first person that says, well, I could do this. And what about if we tried this? And it allows people to say, you know what, rather than it's a conflict where I want this and you want that, we're now saying it's a problem that we both need to resolve and or maybe collectively resolve as a team, and here's the way that we can start doing that. The worst thing that prolongs conflict on a team is not finding a way to engage the team, thinking that the leader needs to solve the whole thing, solve it for them, because we're never going to be right, we're never going to be able to do it. People are going to sort of stand back and they're going to criticize. So anytime we're looking at resolving conflict effectively, we need to have engagement, we need to have discussion, and we need to focus on what are the things that we can do to resolve the conflict. And when people start to see that we can make some progress, they often start to say, okay, I can do this, I can do that. All right, let's try this, let's try that. And we see a way to resolve the conflict.
Okay, last question for you, and this one deals with emotions. Are emotions ever beneficial when properly managing conflict?
Are emotions ever beneficial when resolving conflict? Emotions generally do not help when we're in the middle of conflict, because what happens is people key off the emotions. So what'll happen is you'll find sometimes if I'm very emotional and I'm trying to resolve conflict, the other person often reacts sometimes more to the emotion than to the actual words. And so the emotions tend to be a distraction to to the other person. I mean, one of the things about emotions and conflict is that we tend to use our emotions as a way to telegraph to other people to support me, help me, gang up against this other person so that I'm right. I'm not going to say it directly, but my emotional state will be one that I'm trying to engage others to support me. So, in that sense, if that's what's happening, it's not going to be helpful to resolving the conflict. Usually the most important thing to do is to de-emotionalize, to step aside from our emotions. Now, some people I understand, and I'm one of them, I'm extremely emotional, and this is my constant challenge in resolving conflict. I need to put down my emotions. I need to sort of put them aside for a second and focus on what's actually happening, what are the facts. The good thing is that those emotions can help you later on when it comes to that rebuilding and building the relationship. Now, assuming, and this is one of the things when you start to look at personality differences, some people are just very unemotional. And some people, based on their personality, conflict doesn't bother them. They use it as a tool. They use it to disrupt. They use it to upset other people. And while other people are getting all emotional about it, they're off doing what they want to do because it's a distraction. So often the emotional aspect of conflict is distracting and it's not helpful, but we can use our emotions afterwards to rebuild the relationship. And again, we would be looking to be appropriate to the other person. So some people are less emotional, so we don't want to be overly emotional with them. But generally, our emotions are not our friend when it comes to resolving conflict.
Okay, thank you. And you had started to allude to some related topics. You've got a slide up on the screen. Was there anything more you'd like to say there?
Well, so yeah, so when you start to look at conflict resolution, it happens in so many ways. So when we look at it from a leadership perspective, it's like, how do leaders, we had one question from someone, how do I deal with a conflict from a direct report? So it's a challenge for a leader to negotiate conflict. It's also something that we can expect on a team. So teams go through different stages of working together. One of those stages is called storming, which is also known as conflict. So it's good for us to understand our role in terms of helping our team resolve conflict and deal with it. Negotiation skills is really, in a sense, a subset of conflict resolution. So if you look at in the courses that we teach, we use the Harvard Law School program on negotiation, which is anchored in conflict resolution. And so conflict resolution is really, a subset of negotiation skills. So there's a high connection there. Emotional intelligence and workplace effectiveness, the more we know about ourselves from our own emotional perspective and our own personality, the more effective it's going to make us in being able to manage our emotions, control ourselves, and deal with conflict. Now, I'm not saying any of this is easy. Conflict resolution is never easy. But then you start to look at managing and leading change, which is one of the biggest sources of conflict in the workplace. So we look at strategies on how do we engage others, how do we manage conflict in a way that doesn't emotionalize it. And lastly, our communication skills are the one tool that we have that we can use to to negotiate as well as manage and resolve conflict. The worst thing we see in terms of conflict resolution is when people stop talking, stop communicating, because at that point it becomes impossible to resolve the conflict. It becomes possible to discuss the different positions. So all of these are very much related, but you'll see if you think about it, they're all pretty much anchored in our emotional intelligence and how we handle ourselves. And often, when like many things, right? When we're talking about conflict resolution, I can't control you, but I can control me. I can control how I approach a particular situation. And often, for example, if I'm dealing with somebody who's really emotional, and I appear very calm and factual, and I'm not attacking and I'm not defending my position, a lot of times what you'll see is the other person will move into a similar perspective because they start to find, well, their emotional state is a little bit exaggerated or it's a little bit obvious in comparison to my perspective. So I find that that can really be helpful. I think the other thing to think about here is also, understanding the difference between aggression and being assertive. A lot of people, have trouble with conflict resolution because they think about aggression versus being assertive, and having some skills in assertiveness, which we talk about in some of these courses, can definitely help you be a better person at resolving conflict, because you're taking out the aggression part, which is the emotionally charged part.
Okay, Brent, thank you very much for sharing your time and as well as your expertise with us today. Very much appreciated. I'd like to thank everyone that attended, and a quick reminder that we have 3 more webinars coming up over the next 3 months. Brent's going to be joining us again on October the 8th for a Masterful Leadership webinar. We also have 2 machine learning webinars that are coming up, one on September the 17th, that's software testing for machine learning, and on November the 5th, we have real-world security issues with machine learning. So I'd like to thank everyone, and look in your email towards the latter part of next week. We will have the edited final production recording of the presentation available to you, as well as a copy of the slide deck that Brent presented today. Again, thank you, Brent, and thank you, audience.
Thank you very much, and thank you everybody for attending. Have a great rest of the day.